nail and I smash them as I pass. All the bushes busting outside, they really need a trim. I guess that it's about time, such an inconvenience. So upstairs I ran a step down to take my polish off, but as I'm looking around I realize what I forgot. The mail from the mailman is still inside the box, and now my nails and my nail beds are suffer in the cost. Ooh, 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 la 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 la. Ooh, 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 la 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 la. Ooh, 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 la 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 la. Now my nails and my nail beds are suffer in the cost. Ooh, 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 la 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 la. Ooh, 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 la 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 la.
საოცარი მსგავსება თევზებსა და თქვენს შორის ადამიანიც არსება ყველა არსებას შორის ისევ გიჭირს გარჩევა არასწორის და სწორის ეს სულ სხვა მოთავსება სხვა გალაქტიკებს შორის აღარ აპირებს გადაღებას ეს წეული წვიმა გავწდინაპირებს და თან გავაპირდაპირ შივა შივა არაფერს მაკლებს კეთილია შივა შივა დატოვებს გაკლებს სახე გამისატივა მინდა შენთან ერთად სადმე მაღალ მთაზე ავიდე მინდა შენთან ერთად ოკეანის ფსკერზე ჩავიდე შენმა ნახე ჩიხი მე განახებ როგორ გავიდე შენი ნარკოტიკი თუ ვარ მაშინ კიდევ გამიძლე არ ვითამაშე ვერცხლთან როლშიც არ შევიჭერი ვარ აღმაშენებელთან პეტრიცი იბერი და ვატრიალოთ ღმერთთან ბონგი ატომის ფერი მე ვიტრიალებ ცეცხლთან შენოვონთ და გვიჭერი არაფერს ვადგენ ვარ მე სარკე თქვენი ქალაქებო და თქვენი ზომბებო პროგრამებო და არაფრებო მე სულ ჩავშლი თქვენს გეგმებს მექნება სადამდეც დრო არ გაბედო რომ მიყბედო სანამ ვარ საგანგებო არაფერს ვადგენ ვარ მე სარკე თქვენი ქალაქებო და თქვენი ზომბებო პროგრამებო და არაფრებო მე სულ ჩავშლი თქვენს გეგმებს მექნება სადამდეც დრო არ გაბედო რომ მიყბედო სანამ ვარ საგანგებო მივყვებით მე და მეგობარი გზას ვუყურებ ერთმანეთს არ ვიღებთ ხმას ვივლის და დრო ავხედავთ ცეს და როცა ნერვებს აღარ მოთოკავს და იმ მსგავსება უცებობო ქარს გამოიძახებს ყველა ჯადო ქარს უკან დასახებზეს გადაკეტავს მაგრამ აქედანაც დავიძროენ თავს შეეშვი აბსურდებს მით უმეტეს თუ ხარ ზრდასრული შენ ფიქრობ არ მსახურებს საუკეთესოს მეფის ასული დაბრუნებული არა მაგრამ მინახავს ბევრი წასული მე სულ ღია ვარ უფლებას გაძლევ სულ იყო გასული არა იცი რა ვერ გავიგე აქედან როგორ გავიდე ასეთი რავალი დავიდე რომ ერაფრით ვერ გადამიდე შენ თქვი ვინ ქმნის ამინდებს ცხელს როგორც პირამიდებს მითხარი ვერავინ გაგვიგებს ვინ უყვართ შენ დინამიკებს და შენ სათქმელს ვინც გართმევს მას ქვია ეგო ვინც დაგსდევს და განგრევს ის სულ უნდა ბეგო ვატანქარებს ამ წერილს თქვენთან სხვებოდა მთებო წერ ყაჩახს და შერიფს დღეს ვარ საგანგებო არაფერს ვადგენ ვარ მე სარკე თქვენი ქალაქებო და თქვენი ზომბებო პროგრამებო და არაფრებო მე სულ ჩავშლი თქვენს გეგმებს მექნება სადამდეც დრო არ გაბედო რომ მიყვედო სანამ ვარ საგანგებო არაფერს ვადგენ ვარ მე სარკე თქვენი ქალაქებო და თქვენი ზომბებო პროგრამებო და არაფრებო მე სულ ჩავშლი თქვენს გეგმებს მექნება სადამდეც დრო არ გაბედო რომ მიყვედო სანამ ვარ საგანგებო
if we want to. And then on our right, we can have our CSS. Now, normally I would do that. Some people actually has multiple monitors, and they'll do, you know, one's there on one monitor, the other one's on the other monitor. But this is a way to do it within a single monitor, because when you're writing CSS, you're kind of always referring back to your HTML markup, because that kind of guides your decisions over here in terms of your what are called selectors. I'm not going to do that though, because I have everything enlarged up, and it's just, I don't have a lot of space to work with. So I will be manually clicking back and forth up top, going back and forth like that. All right, so when it comes to your CSS, the first element that you can style, and you don't have to like style it at the first time, or I'll show you what I mean, is the body tag. So the body tag is where you define like the background of the website. So if it's in body, we can give it a background color, and there is a specific background color that I'm using that isn't white. By default, it's white in HTML in the browser, as you can see, but this is kind of like a gray, a very light gray. So I'm gonna click over here, copy this hex color code. All right, that's called a hex value. And we're going to say background, and then colon, and then paste that in, and then hit semicolon and hit save. Now you can see it's that color. We could, in Visual Studio Code, if you hover over that value, then it gives us this color picker. And so notice the hex value, all those crazy numbers, is how we're able to communicate the color to the browser. So if we say this is red, guess what? And hit save, it changes it to red and makes it look really ugly. So let's go back, Control Z. There we go, it's F2, F2, F2. And so this is what a CSS rule set looks like. Here's what it consists of. Let me hit Control+ here to make this bigger a few times. It is, first we have what's called a selector. The selector can be a variety of things. But primarily, it can be two different things. It can be the name of the HTML element itself, like body, div, img, nav, or it can also be like a class. All right, so class equals navbar, container. So that's just called a selector. You can also have multiple selectors, like separated by comma, like body, and then maybe something like nav. And the reason you might have multiple selectors is because they might be styled with the same exact properties, okay? So now inside of this, we open this up in order to specify our CSS properties. So we have this little squiggly brace right here, or bracket, and then it closes right here at the end. You're always going to have that sort of situation when you're working with CSS or Sass. Then we have the actual property name. Background is a CSS property name. Then after the property name, you put a semicolon right here to denote that's the end of the name. And then you also denote that this is the beginning of the associated value. So in the case of background, we have a hex value right here. All right. And then you end it with a semicolon. And if you want to have multiple properties, which we will in this case, we put in a second line, the same format, property, value, this will be margin, and then a colon, and then the property. We're going to put 0, and then we end the statement with a semicolon, just like we did up there. Margin 0, by default, browsers add a little bit of margin. It's called margin. It's white space on the edge. I always just remove that and I add my own. I just kind of reset it to 0 in the body tag and hit save. So now notice how it kind of just fell back up there. Then we're going to have another one. We can put font family. All right, I'm going to use something called Poppins. Now, when I save that, not every, as you, we're going to go to fonts.google.com, and Poppins is a font that is available here at Google. Load, because the browser has to, or your phone or whatever has to download this information. So we can stick with like a regular, and we can also click on a bold, like at import. Then we paste it up there. X2 because right and okay. So next up, we're going to start writing out our core CSS, CSS, and we have to ask ourselves, in the same way, like when we started writing HTML, we started to look at, you know, the top of our design document to guide our decisions for HTML. We're going to do the same thing with CSS. We're going to look over here to see what's happening first, and we're going to style those accordingly. Now, it doesn't really matter the order of your CSS rule sets. It doesn't matter at all, but it does kind of make sense for organizational purposes to have all your rule sets kind of cascade the way that it's occurring here. So we have our navbar class or a div element, and that's in relation to this big white container right here. So we're going to reference our class of navbar like this, period navbar. So that basically means the period means it's a class, and navbar is the name. So any properties that we open up here and we specify, they're going to be specific to this element or any other element that has class of navbar. Okay. So looking at our code up here, we need to get this right here, this whole section right here, looking like this, because we're doing mobile first. Just the logo and just this little hamburger menu. All right, so for navbar, the first thing we're going to set is the background. The background is going to be white. So you can enter in multiple different types of, there's different ways in order to specify color in CSS. You can do hex values, you can do what's RGB, RGBA, HSL. There's a lot of different ways. I don't want to, confuse you too much, but you can also write out common color names as well. So now you can see it's just this white color, and you can see the difference between the shades here. So background white, and we're going to also have padding. So padding is another CSS value. By the way, if we type in CSS in Google, we'll see W3 Schools. There's a whole CSS section on W3 Schools as well. Tremendously popular site. It's 186th largest website in the world. So it's a very popular site. And again, when it comes to all these CSS properties, of which there are many, you can go here and refer to see exactly how they're used. Okay. So same thing with HTML. So we're going to have padding. All right. So what padding is padding is very similar to margin. So margin affects everything outside of that element. So when you add margin, like in certain values, like for instance, if I change this to like 5 M units, look how, wow, it looks like it broke something here. There we go. Look how much margin it added there. Or if we change this to 2, we have a little bit less. So it affects everything outside. Now, if we did padding, padding's the opposite of margin because padding affects everything that's on the inside of an element. So let me demonstrate this. Let's put this back to 0. And don't worry, I'll describe what that M thing unit is in a little bit. But we're going to put here a padding of 1 M unit. Notice how it pushed everything away. So padding works on the inside, whereas margin works on the outside. Let me bring up the developer tools, Control-Shift-I, and we're going to click this little button where it says select an element when you hover over it. Notice when we hover over it, it's showing us all this stuff. So when we hover over the navbar element right here, and it shows you right here, it does like a little thing, it says div.navbar underneath where I'm hovering. It's like right by my mouse right now. It shows you this green outline right here. That is the padding value, and it's on the inside. So notice if we hover over here, like it's nitty and gritty, we have these borders on the top that are orange and bottom that are orange. That's margin, and that's default margin that the browser has added onto this element. So notice it's on the outside of the element, but this padding is on the inside. So that's important to understand. So you're going to be using that value, those properties of padding and margin big time. So that's why I'm spending a little bit of time talking about it. So we have that set to 1 M unit. By the way, my browser is all the way up to 175. It should be this size right here. And so that gives us a little bit of that padding, that white space, because when it comes to UI design, you don't want things slapped up against edges and stuff like that. This looks bad. So that's why we add padding right there. All right. So now another thing we need to do is to style up this logo. This looks nothing like but CSS units. If you're confused about, what out the PX, which is for a pixel, which is absolute M, just type CSS M, or what's called the color scheme. And it's not just for Sass. Sass used to have variables, and it still does, and you can still use them, but CSS natively in the browser didn't have anything like that. But it does now, and it has for a couple years, and they're called custom properties. Here's how you do it. So any type of property value and any type of property value that's reused often throughout your document, you can define up here inside a colon. Hopefully that makes sense. This says none. This says flex. Flexbox. Flex is short for flexbox, and it's a certain way to structure layouts. Now notice we have our navbar, then we have our container. and we're going to reference this container in order to separate this logo from this graphic right here. This little hamburger menu needs to be over here. So what I'm going to do is say container display flex. Now notice this says none, this says flex. Flexbox, flex is short for flexbox, and it's a certain way to structure layouts. There's also the grid. There's also a couple other property values for display that you can use based on your needs. So we're going to put display flex and then place content space hyphen between. When we do that, it moves this over. This logo from this graphic right here, this little hamburger menu needs to be over here. So what I'm going to do is say container display flex. Now notice this says none, this says flex. Flexbox, flex is short for flexbox, and it's a certain way to structure layouts. There's also the grid. There's also a couple other property values for display that you can use based on your needs. So we're going to put display flex and then place content space hyphen between. When we do that, it moves this over. So if you want to learn more about Flexbox, there are entire courses on learning CSS Flexbox and tutorials, of course. So I'm not going to get into that because it would just make this extremely long. This is a crash course.
just style them in a way that makes the website look good, because now that you've learned the tools to create a responsive container, you can go through and actually start practically applying it to the real world. All right, let's move on. So in this video, we are going to be looking at grid versus flexbox. Now, in the previous section, we looked at flexbox as a whole. We looked at all the different container properties. We also looked at some of the other properties that we can use on our items. But today, we're going to be looking at a different type of, well, layout property, and that is grid. So before we get started, I'm going to give a little introduction to grid and what it actually is. So similar to Alright, so that's pretty much it for fonts. Next, we're going to move on to layout, which is really going to change the way that this website looks. Alright, let's move on. So the next few videos are going to be focused on CSS layout. So we're pretty much done, at least for now, with coloring and text and all of the cool features we can do with them. But now we're going to actually go through and start using our skills with different, well, new skills that we can actually put together and create really, really nice, awesome websites. So layout is probably one of the most powerful tools that you can use in CSS and can completely change the way your website looks. But before we move on, we need to learn a little bit of theory behind how CSS works. So there's this concept in CSS called the box model, and it's pretty much what happens is every single element is surrounded by an invisible box. Now this box has different layers, which we're going to explain in the next video, but all of these boxes are touching together. They're kind of connected. And what you can do is actually change the shapes of these boxes and change the shapes of the layers in order to move things around and position them on a page in a way that makes the website look much better. Now, obviously, this isn't the only way of shaping your website. There are so many different methods, flexbox and grid, and we're all going to cover them later in this course. But for now, this is the basic kind of layout features that you need to use so that you can move on and start using some of the most complex features. So this is kind of what that invisible box looks like. So at the center is where your content is. Now, I'm going to explain this in just a second, all of these little terms, padding, border, and margin. But you can see that the center contains the content, but then the other three layers are something completely unknown, and we're going to be going through and explaining what those do. But for now, just understand that you have the content on the center, but then there's this invisible box around it that is split up into three layers. So let's go over the first one, which is the padding. Now, the padding represents the space between the content and the border of the content. Now, you can see up in this model, we have this padding section, and then we have a border. So pretty much what the border does is it separates the content and the padding from the margin. But pretty much, let's just assume for now that the margin kind of moves things around and it doesn't actually move the content around. What padding is supposed to do is it's basically supposed to give more room around the content itself. It's not really meant to move the content around. So it'll make more sense when I go over margin if you don't understand it now, but let's move on to the next layer. The border is pretty much the divide or the separation line between the content, the padding, and the margin. So borders can be styled and changed, and by default they're invisible, but we can actually go through and change how they look, which we're going to be going through in a couple videos time. So the border doesn't actually create any spacing or anything itself unless you want it to, but pretty much what the border is supposed to be is kind of that division line. So the last layer that I want to talk about is the margin. So just like how the padding is supposed to give spacing, or well, padding around the content, the margin is supposed to move the content around and give it space between other elements. So while the padding is used for internal space, the margin is used for external space and is made so that to give room and spacing around external elements. So for example, if you have a an image and then some text under it, you can use the margin of the text to kind of push it down from the image, whereas the padding would just kind of make internal space. Now, although it's not the best example, as we go on and start using it, you'll get this a lot more if you don't already. Alright, so that's pretty much it for the box model. It's a very, very simple concept, but it can be really used to a very high potential, and it does contain a lot of features that we're going to be going over in the next few videos. Alright, let's move on. So now what we're going to be doing is going through and starting to use the first layer of the box model, which in this case is the content itself. So although not technically a layer of this invisible box, it's still a big part of layout and the shaping of things on your document, because the way you shape and, well, style your content is going to completely change how the rest of the box model is affected, your padding and your margin. So what we're going to be doing is going through and using some of these. And if you actually remember, right here we have already used the two main features of shaping content, height and width. So we've already pretty much learned these properties, but I'm going to go through and do a couple more examples just so you can get the shape of things and how to use them. So first thing I want to talk about is the units that you should use. So usually on a page, the best way to do this is using pixels or some absolute unit for height, but then for width, use a relative unit such as VW or percentage. Now, we do this because although height is very, very hard to determine, responsively at least, they kind of stay the same as you move down. So the height is going to kind of stay consistent. The only problem is the width completely changes everything. So the width of devices is very different from place to place. So a phone would be quite a small width, whereas, a full screen TV would be a very wide width. So that's why you use relative units for width, is that you can keep it consistent while you can keep both of the values consistent while still using different units. So let's go through and actually use it on this image here. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and give this a class, or actually I'm going to give it an ID. So I'm going to give it an ID of about us image, just like that. All right, now let's go ahead and select it here. I'm going to go hash about us image. Remember the ID selector. And now what we're going to do is go through and start adding our ID selector. First thing I want to do is go ahead and of about us image, just like that. All right, now let's go ahead and select it here. I'm going to go hash about us image. Remember the ID selector. And now what we're going to do is go through and start adding our properties. So the first thing I'm going to add is the height. So I'm just going to make this a cool 300 pixels just to see how it is. And most of this is very experimental. You're not supposed to go through and change everything and, well, you are, but you're not supposed to go through and set everything to a constant value. So you're supposed to, play around, see what works. And then when you're familiar with it and what you want, you can leave it as it is. So there we go. We set the height. Now, obviously, this with the width of the image itself is always relative, but I'm going to go ahead and change it anyways. I'm going to go ahead and say the width is 60 VW. Now, you could always say 60%. It would pretty much be the same thing, but I'm going to go ahead and use VW here just to, actually, you know what? We have VW here already, so I'm going to go ahead and add percentage. There we go. Now, of course, you could use whichever unit you want. They're going to mean pretty much the same thing. Obviously apart from the different viewports and things like that, but they're pretty much the same for our purposes, so you can use whichever one you want. So there we go. We've changed it, and now if we go ahead and resize, you can actually go ahead and see that the width is going to be pretty much the same while the height stays constant. So one thing I want to talk about is a really cool feature that we can use in Chrome. And you can see that's a little bit weird there, but we'll worry about that later. It's a really cool feature that allows you to actually change the viewport of your Chrome window without actually having to use different devices. So if you go ahead and click on that icon, just right click anywhere on the page, click on inspect, and it's going to bring you here to this page. And you can actually select any device you want from the drop down menu and see how it would look on that device. So I can pretty much do whatever I want here. If I wanted to select an iPad, even an iPad Pro, you can actually see what it would look like on the device. So this is a really useful feature that you can use to make sure that your website works everywhere, instead of having to go and upload it somewhere and then view it on all those different devices. You can also select this responsive design, which I really like, because then you can change the size however you want, just like that, you can see, and it will work perfectly. So yeah, that's great. And you know, if you don't want to use these devices from this drop-down menu, you can actually go through and change the size here, which is really useful. So I'm going to go ahead and close this off now, and you can see that our website is looking good. Obviously, our image here looks quite weird, but like I said, it's all about experimentation. You're supposed to go through and see what works. And obviously, you don't have to use an absolute value. It's not set in stone, but you're supposed to go through and see what works for you, and from there, you can set the values. So this is just kind of a little experimental thing to teach you how to use these features. But like I said, this website's all about, or this course is all about practicing and getting experience with this, so you can go through, check out the project files and play around with these values yourself. Really get a feel for how this works. So that's pretty much it for content resizing. It's very easy. There's only 2 properties you need to know, and pretty much the rest of the box model is also quite easy. But it's good that we learn it step by step so that we master every stage.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write essays that inspire,
And by the end of it, we'll really know how to master the layout and really manipulate our page in the best possible way. All right, let's move on. So in this video, we're going to be focusing on one of the parts of the box model, which are borders. So in the previous video, I talked a little bit about some of the different layers of the box model and how they work. But in this video, we're actually going to be focusing on manipulating one of those layers, which is the border. And although it's not really the main part of the whole box model idea, it's still a pretty useful skill to know, and it really helps you understand how the box model comes together. All right, let's get started. So for the next few videos, we're mainly going to be working with the images simply because they're just easier to manipulate and set the layout over something working with something like text or titles, things like that. So we're going to be working with our circular gradient here that we created in a previous video, as well as this custom image. So let's get started. So now there are many different styles that you can use to style the borders, but we're going to be using the main shorthand that allows us to style everything all at once. So the property is similar to our background property here. All you need to type is border. Whoops, we need to do on the image. So I'm going to go here on our radial gradient, and I'm going to start adding our border. So let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do is just type border, and remember, every single element has a box around it, has this box model or invisible box. So it doesn't matter what you choose, you can always style these elements. It might look weird on some elements like this text here, but you can do it with everything. So there are 3 main parts to this element here. First is going to be the size, so we'll talk about that in a second. Then you're going to have the style, which is probably the main part. And then finally, you're going to have the color. So now that we have this, we can go ahead and start talking about this. So size is pretty similar to, changing the size of an image, for example. Yeah, it can be in pixels, percent, or EM, it doesn't matter. I'm going to go with pixels for now. Now the usual range for a border is somewhere between 1 and 3 or 4 pixels, but you can go much thicker than that depending on what you need. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what 2 pixels looks like. So remember, separated by a space. Now we're going to go over the style. So there are many different styles that you can use on your borders, but there's 3 main ones that we're going to talk about, 4 main ones we're going to talk about: dotted, dashed, solid, and double. Now, normally you're going to see solid. That's pretty much the most common one. I'll show you the other versions of this in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and type solid. And now comes the color. So as we learned before, this can be a named color, this can be an RGB code, or even a hex code. I'm going to go ahead and just choose a darkish blue. I think that will fit in really well with the page. And in fact, you know what? Let's not use the color picker. Let's just use our RGB color skills and take the color of the background, which is here. So we're going to take those 4. And now I'm going to go back to our image here and paste it in. Oh, whoops. And now what I'm going to do is just darken everything. And if you remember, the darker it gets, the higher the lower all of these values get. So I'm just going to lower them all by about 50. So here I'm just going to go 154. Now again, this doesn't have to be exact or anything. You can put really whatever you want here, but I'm just trying to darken everything. I'm just going to make this 200. So let's go ahead and refresh the page and see how our border looks now. Let's scroll down. So there's the problem. We actually forgot a semicolon here on the end of the background. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind. There we go. Now it's working. And you can see, and I did actually change the color there just to test it out. And you can see, there we go. We have our background. So obviously it's pretty obvious here with our bright red color there, but what I'm actually going to do is go ahead and just play around with some of these and see if we can change the features. So first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and change the height. So I'm going to go ahead and set it as 10 pixels, for example. And you can see that the size. And you can see that that gets a lot thicker. So you can change it depending on how you want your border to look like. So now let's go ahead and change the style. So let's go ahead and try out some of these other styles. So first I'm going to try dotted. So you can see now we have a dotted border. Now let's go ahead and try dashed. And you're kind of getting the idea of how this works. Let's see doubled, or double actually. I think that's probably the best other than solid. Yeah, you can see that that looks pretty nice here. We have that double border. It's pretty useful in styling, but it's not really used very commonly. So the last thing I'm going to go ahead and change is the color. So I'm going to go ahead and just take a color from the color picker. I don't really feel like going through the whole RGB process again. Let's go ahead and just take this color. It's quite dark. Let's go ahead and refresh our page and see what it looks like. And now you can see the color has changed. So you can see that borders are not only useful for just changing the style of an image or a box or any box for that matter. They're also useful for showing how the box model works. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to solid so you can get a better view. So if you remember in the last video, we talked about the different layers of the box model, and we remembered that the padding was used to separate or create spacing between the content and the border. In this case, you can see that the border and the content are directly touching, which means there is pretty much no padding at all because there's no spacing between them. On top of that, you can see that this border is also touching elements on the page or other elements on the page. So like for example, this table, there's a little bit of space between the header and the image, but that's due to other margins. We'll talk about that when we get later in this section. And so you can see that this doesn't have much margin either. So you can start to see here how this whole box model comes together and how you can see what's going on. So yeah, that's a pretty useful way to kind of look at the box model and see how everything comes together. In the next few videos, we're going to be looking at the other layers of the box model, and then we're going to bring it all together and start really changing up the way this website looks. All right, let's move on. So in this video, we're going to be moving on to the next two main layers of our box model. And in this video, we're going to be talking about margin and padding. So you kind of already have an idea of what these two are. We've talked about them in the first video, we've talked about what they do, but we haven't actually talked about how to manipulate them. So in this video, what I'm going to be doing is going through and working with these two properties to actually manipulate our layout, and that's when the real power of the box model shows. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is go ahead and choose the right thing to manipulate. And in this case, the best thing to work with is an image right here, because it's very easy to see and see the changes when you do these margin and padding changes. And it's also very useful to have a border here, which I added, so you can really see the difference between margin and padding and to see which one is responsible for what. So let's get started. Now, similar to the rest of the properties, the naming is pretty straightforward. In this case, we're going to go ahead and use the shorthand margin property, but I'm also going to be showing you a few other ways, which I didn't show you with the border, because these are a little bit easier and they're kind of hard to understand if you just use the shorthand property, so I'm going to be just building it from the ground up. So the first property I'm going to look at is, of course, the shorthand margin property and how to add margin and padding to all sides at the same time. So in case you didn't know, this is called top, this is called bottom, this is left, and this is right. But I'm sure you know that, especially with working with multiple backgrounds, things like that. And pretty much the same throughout all of CSS. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and find my image, and then I'm going to choose which box model layer I want to manipulate. I'm going to go ahead and work with padding first, because it's a little bit easier to understand. Then we're going to go and work with margin. So we're just going to type out padding here, and now what we're going to do is go and start adding whatever we want. So remember, if you add just one value, it's going to add it the same value to all sides. So I'm going to say, for example, right now 20 pixels. Now if I go ahead and refresh the page, you can see that there is 20 pixels of space between all sides of our image. So you can see 20 pixels on the left, on the right, on the top, and on the bottom. So you can see what's going on here with our padding. If we increase this value, for example, it's going to almost double, and now we have 40 pixels on each side. So that's just a little bit of information about padding. You can see the spacing between the content and the border is getting a lot bigger. Now let's go ahead and change this to margin and see what happens. So I'm actually just going to completely remove this and refresh the page. So now let's go ahead and add our 40 pixel margin. We'll just say for now, so you can really see the difference. So now you can see that the content, or the space between the content and the border, is still the same. There's no spacing at all. But you can see that everything around it has kind of been pushed down. And remember, it's adding margin to all sides. There's 40 pixels between the border and the left side of the page, the border on the top side, the border on the right, and the border and the bottom. So you can see that margin is moving the image itself around the page, whereas the padding is just adding space inside the image. So now let's go ahead and talk about some of the more specific properties in case you wanted to maybe style specific sides. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to padding, just like this. And now we can go ahead and see our differences a lot more clear. So what you can actually do is add a dash and then the name of the side to it to actually specify which side you want the padding to be added to. So let's just say I wanted to add it to the right side. Now if I refresh the page, you can see that all of this still stays the same, but on the right side there is 40 pixels of padding. You can do this with as many as you want, so you can go padding top, for example, and I want 100 pixels on the top, and let's just say on the bottom. And remember, always with the dash, I just want only 5 pixels. Now if we go ahead and refresh the page, you can see it looks quite unbalanced, but we have 100 pixels on the top, we have 40 pixels on the right, and 5 on the bottom. Now obviously this gets a little bit tedious after a while, after you keep, doing padding right, top, bottom, left, top, top right, bottom left, and it gets quite irritating after a while. So what I'm going to do is show you a really cool shorthand that you can use to style them all at the same time. So we're going to go back to using our shorthand property. And now we're going to go ahead and add 4 values separated by spaces. But it's a little bit confusing at first, okay? So just bear with me. Now, what I'm going to do is for the left, I don't want anything. So, oh, whoops, I need to start from the top. So on the top, I want 100 pixels, like that. On the right, I want 40 pixels. On the left, I don't want anything, so I'm just going to say 0. Now, you could say 0 pixels, but in this case, we don't want anything at all, so it doesn't really matter which one you choose. I just prefer to put a 0 there. And then, of course, on the right, on the bottom, we want 5 pixels. Now, let's go ahead and refresh and see what happens. It stays pretty much, oh, whoops, must have confused something over there. So 100 on the top, we have 40 on the right, and on the bottom, there's the problem. On the bottom, we want 5 pixels, and on the left, we want 0. So you can see it gets quite confusing after some time. So you can see that now it's exactly the same. So here's what you have to kind of remember. The first one is the top, the second is the right, then the bottom and left. So an easy way to remember this is by looking at the pieces of the border. If you draw a diagonal line straight in half, you style the top and the right first, and then the bottom and the left. So just keep that in mind and you'll be fine. So if you ever forget, you can always go and check online. There's a lot of references taught after some time. So you can see that now it's exactly the same. So here's what you have to kind of remember. The first one is the top, the second is the right, then the bottom and left. So an easy way to remember this is by looking at the pieces of the border. If you draw a diagonal line straight in half, you style the top and the right first, and then the bottom and the left. So just keep that in mind and you'll be fine. So if you ever forget, you can always go and check online. There's a lot of references talking about these different values here, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and change it to margin for a second so you can see what's going on. Now you can see if I change the margin, actually it stays in the same position, but instead of adding internal space, it's adding external space. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. But like I said, if you want to go ahead and review this, you can always find some resources online. There's a lot going on there. Now let's talk about shortening this into actually only 2 sections, because let's just say on the top and bottom you want a certain margin, but then on the left and right you want another. This is a pretty common thing that you're going to want to do in CSS. So I'm going to show you how to do that. All you have to do is go ahead and shorten it to 2 values. I'm actually going to go ahead. Yeah, I'll go with margin. The first 2 values are going to be for the top and bottom at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and add 80 pixels of padding. Oh, whoops. 80 pixels, there we go. And now for our second value, it's going to be our left and right values at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and add 40 pixels. Doesn't matter the order, because this is always going to be for the top and bottom. This is always going to be for the left and right. So just make sure that they are equal. So let's go ahead and refresh. And now you can see the left and right have kind of stayed a little bit shorter, whereas the top and bottom are the margin is very big. As you can see here, the top and bottom is double the left and right. So that's a nice shorthand that you can use to style 2 different sides. So for example, now if you can just take this part and this part, style them at the same time, and then you take the left and right and do the same thing with them. So I know that's a lot to take in and it's a lot of different ways, but just remember, if you ever get confused, you can either use the internet or just use margin dash and then the position. But other than that, all you need to know for now is the concept. You just need to know how margin and padding work and how you can actually manipulate them. What they do, I mean, what do you do when you say the margin left is 10 pixels? So just make sure that you know that, when you add a certain space to a position, you're basically changing the spacing between something and another thing based on whichever layer you chose. So for example, if you chose padding, you're going to be changing the spacing between the content and the border. So that's pretty much it for margin and padding. Now we're going to get a lot more experience with this as we go through the course and style more things. But for now, just make sure you know how to use these shorthand properties, you know how to use all those different shortcuts. Now you don't need to memorize them, you just need to know kind of how they work. Obviously memorizing them is good, but if
So you want to be a software engineer at Google? Go to algoexpert.io. Pick a question, read the prompt.
If you forget them, don't worry too much about that. Just make sure you know how to use these properly, and that's pretty much it. Let's move on. So this is a pretty important video because we're talking about a concept that is going to be used constantly in the next few sections, and it's a very, very important part of CSS and kind of defines the way that you look at documents. So the 2 properties that we're going to be looking at are float, which is the less important one, and display, which is the very important property that we need to learn. So let's cover float first because it's an easier thing to approach. But before we start, for both of these elements, you need to understand the concept of inline and block level elements. So first of all, elements have a certain display type, which we're going to be, manipulating in the next property. This display type pretty much defines the behavior of the element. So there are 2 main display types, block and inline. So pretty much, if we look at our HTML document here, we go through and you can see all of these tags. creating these tags create a sort of display behavior for the content inside them. So the block level element, what it basically does is moves everything onto its own section, its own, well, block. So an example of one of these elements would be a p tag. You can see that if this was an inline element, it would be flowing with the rest of the things. But you can see here, despite the margin, this is moved onto its own section. It's not playing or moving after the image. It's moved onto its own section, and everything after it comes after, well, the block. On the other hand, an inline element is something that won't really move anything onto its own section. It's going to keep it intact. It's not going to move it or change it in any way. It's just going to leave it how it naturally occurs on the page. So an example, a very good example of one of these would be a span tag, because what a span tag pretty much does is it's used to contain some piece of content in an inline style. So for example, this italics class would be a perfect representation of an inline tag. What we're trying to do is italicize some text. And if the span was a block level element, this text here, this italicized text, would be moved onto its own section. So everything preceding it would come before it, and then there would be a new line with the text, and then after it would come the rest of the text. So you can see there that the inline and block level tags really make a difference depending on what you want to use it for. So what we're going to be doing in this video is going through and learning how to change the display type of these different elements. But first, let's talk about float. So again, these tags come with a natural display type, and how they are placed on the page is how they naturally occur. But there's actually a way to change the way that they look, and this is done using float. So if you just listen to the name there, what the element pretty much does is change how the element, well, floats on the page. So I'll go ahead and do some examples here. For example, let's just take this gradient here, this div. So I'm going to go and look for it, the service image. I'm going to say set the float, and I'm going to say it floats to the right, and watch what happens. You can see that now what happens is pretty much this just flows over to the right side of the page, and it also changes all the content after it. So you can see that this content here has now been pushed up. So this kind of shows a little bit of how float works. And this doesn't just have to be with images. We can do it with text as well. So if I go through and choose something like this element over here, this link here. So I'm going to go ahead on this link, and I'm going to say it floats to the right. Now let's go ahead and refresh the page, and you can see that that kind of flows over to the right, and everything before it is now kind of pushed up where it was. So you can think of this as kind of a Tetris puzzle block. When you're moving something over, everything is going to be pushed up or moved around as well, so to fit the page. So you can kind of think of it in that way. Now obviously, once you start getting a lot of experience with float, you can kind of predict where everything is going to move on the page. But floats are really useful for laying out documents, especially if you want to kind of position images next to text or move things around in a way that looks more like a proper document. So I'm going to remove that float, and I'm just going to do it with our image over here, with our image, our About Us image. So I'm going to go ahead and say it floats over to the right. See that? So now you can see that it floats over to the right, and now everything before it has kind of been pushed up onto this section here. So there we go. Now it's working and everything is looking great. Now let's look at the next property, which is display. So display is pretty much a way of, well, changing the display property of an element that it naturally comes with. So of course we know things like a div or a paragraph tag come as a block level element, whereas something like a span or a bolding tag would come as an inline element. So what we're going to be doing is going through and changing these properties. Now I didn't actually cover the properties of float, which I'm going to go over in just a second, but what I'm going to talk about is the different properties of display. So of course you have the standard inline and block, which is pretty obvious, but then you have a few others. So the one that I'm going to be covering here is none now. So what the display none property does is pretty much just completely almost remove the element from the page. Now it doesn't actually remove it, but what happens is that invisible box that contains everything just suddenly disappears. You can't see it anymore. It doesn't take up any space. It's just completely gone from the page. So I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. Let's go ahead and, for example, let's just say that this table is kind of annoying. We don't really want it here. So what I'm going to do over here in my table is give it a class of site table. Now I'm going to go ahead and select it here, .site-table, and I'm going to say display is none. Now watch what happens. You can see that that table completely disappears, and it doesn't even take up the space anymore. It's not like the table is just invisible or not visible, but it's completely gone now. This is very, very commonly used once you start using JavaScript and once you start making your sites interactive to maybe create web games or hide something, maybe create some sort of hidden token. It can be used for all sorts of things. So this is a very useful display property. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that. Now the next one I want to talk about, and I'll just keep it there if we decide to use it later. The next one I'm going to talk about is inline block. So we know that we have two different display types, inline and block, but there's actually a combination of the two, which is a little bit hard to understand, but once we start using it, you can see how useful it is. So inline block is a little bit, well, like I said, it's a little bit hard to understand, but pretty much what it does is take features from both inline and block level elements and combines them together. So we know that inline elements do not move anything onto their own line. We know that they stay in their place, they don't touch anything or move anything around. Whereas block level elements move them onto the new line. Now what happens is that this inline block element takes that sort of new line feature and removes it completely. It does not move anything onto its own new line. But what the block level elements do is they actually create some spacing around the element once it's moved onto its new block. So the inline block element then takes this and puts it into itself. So the inline block element pretty much keeps everything in the same line, but creates that block level spacing that it can be found in other block level elements. So let's go through and actually demonstrate how this works. I'm going to go back to my table and add our inline block display property here. Inline block. Now I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page and see what happens. So you can see that it's kind of kept on the same line, but it's given that sort of spacing or, well, block level spacing that you can't really find with a normal inline element. If I actually go ahead and change this to inline here, you'll see this very apparent. You can see that click here to Google text has now moved around. There's a little bit of a weird box here. So you can see the difference between an inline element and an inline block element. So there you go. Inline block is a very useful display property. You can use it a lot in your website to maybe lay out grids and all sorts of things like that. And we're actually going to be using some very special display properties later in this course called Flex and Grid, which are really going to help us create these beautiful grids and layouts that can transform our website in every way. So that's pretty much it for display. Now let's go on to talk about some of the other float properties because I kind of wanted to save it for last. So we already know that there are two main float properties, which are left and right. But there's actually a few more that we can use that are sort of different, and they're not very conventional, but they're still apparent, and they can, change the way that, an element floats on the page. So the first one is the most interesting. One is the one that is, the only real floating element, which is called inherit. So you can see here that we have child elements and parent elements. Now, what's really interesting is what can happen is if we have, let's say, a div with an h2 and an image in it. What we can do is pretty much set the div's float as right, and we can set one of the child elements, such as the h2, we can set its float as inherit. What's going to happen is it's going to take the float property of the parent element. Now, you're probably asking why this would be useful at all. Well, pretty much what you can do is you can actually lay out multiple elements without having to specify their float, as long as they're children and parents. So for example, if you have an element that's maybe 4 or 5 levels deep and you don't want to specify the float every time, you can just use an inherit element to move everything to the right side with only specifying the float once. So the last value I want to talk about is the none value. So this is kind of the default value that you're going to see if you don't specify anything, and it's pretty much just going to keep the item in its place. It's not going to change its float or its display, and it's pretty much not going to move it around at all. It's not the same as display none though. It doesn't really remove anything. What float none pretty much does is just leaves it where it naturally occurs in the text. So for example, if you have a block level div tag and you set its float to none, then it's just going to appear as a block level element. It's not going to move around or do anything similar. So there you go. That's pretty much it for floats and displays. We're going to be working with these a lot throughout the rest of this course, and they're very important properties. So I recommend you get some practice with them and start using them so you can see all of the different ways that you can use the display and float properties in your website. Now, apart from the box model and a few other ways, displays and floats are a very common way, or at least they were, of manipulating your website and making it look really good. So without it, the website is just kind of everywhere. All the elements are scattered around. But if you want to really make the website look how you want it to look, you need to use this in combination with a few other features that we are going to learn in the future in order to make your website look great. All right, let's move on. So today we're going to get started with a new topic in CSS, and this is a very exciting one because we're going to start learning more about very advanced layout techniques. So in the past we've learned about some pretty basic layouts. We've learned about floats and displays and the box model, but they're not really enough to create the best websites possible. To do that, we're going to need some extra advanced techniques, which is what we're going to be covering in the next 3 sections. In this first section, we're going to be looking at CSS Flexbox. Now, I'm going to give a quick introduction to it in this video. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what it is, how it works, and how you can apply it and what you can do with it. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and get started with it. So first of all, what actually is Flexbox? So if you don't know already, Flexbox stands for flexible box, and similar to the box model, it's a concept in CSS or a feature that allows you to create and arrange items or elements very easily. So it's a great alternative to using something like the box model or floats or displays if you want to create very responsive websites or lay out your items in a way that makes it look great. So this is an alternative to using those traditional techniques that were used in earlier versions of CSS. So the flexbox, or the main flexbox, is split into two different components. You have the container and the flex items. So the container is the parent element. It's what is going to become the container for all of the items. Now, usually what you would do is use this on a div or some other form of container element, and then use some special properties, which we're going to be covering in the next video, to create the flex container. But then the next part is the flex items. So this can be pretty much anything you want. Images, links, spans, whatever you want, you can add them as flex items. And this is what makes up the flexbox. Now what you can do with these two components is actually use different properties to manipulate them and create really nice layout like this one that we have here. And that's what we're actually going to be covering in the next few videos, is learning how to manipulate the container as well as the items inside. So what can you actually do with flexbox? Well, you know that you can create these nice responsive grids, but what would you actually use them for? Well, although it might not be apparent, pretty much all pages these days use some form of CSS layout, whether it be the box model or flexbox or CSS grid, which we're going to be covering in the next section. There are so many ways that it can be used. Flexbox is mainly used to lay out a website or create different components. So for example, the top of the page is going to contain your sidebar. That's one flex item. And then you have the right side of your page, which takes up maybe 30% of the page, and that's your so the top is your menu, for example, and then the side on the right is your sidebar. Then you have the rest as content, and you have little widgets everywhere, and you can start to see how this all connects together. You can create really good looking websites by creating one huge flex container and then creating a bunch of separate items, putting all of your different things in those items. So it's pretty much just a way to lay out your website. Now in the past, we've used floats to move images around, and we've used also margin and padding to push things up and down, but that's not a really efficient way. It's more of a kind of hack to move things around, and using something like Flexbox pretty much lets you do all of this naturally. Alright, so there we go. That's a little introduction to Flexbox and how it works. Now what we're going to do is go ahead and go onto our machine and start creating some flex containers. Alright, let's move on. So in this video, we are going to be going ahead and creating our first flex container or flexbox. Now I already have some apparatus set up here so that we can get started straight away without having to go and do anything with any of the styling. And this is the best way to really see how Flexbox works, because without it, you know, it's just kind of it's going to look kind of weird, all the invisible backgrounds and things. So I think this is the best way to really see and demonstrate how Flexbox works. All right, let's get started. So, well, it's actually quite easy to set up a flex container. The hard part is creating it how you want, but it uses the display property just like any other item on this page. So when we set the display to block or inline, we do all of that, but we can actually set it to flex, and what that's going to do is create our flex container. So all we have to do is go ahead and find our parent element, the container that we want, and I already have the class set up here. If you want to go ahead and do this on your own, you can. Like I said, if you want to copy these styles, for example, you can go ahead and check out the project files. But like I said, you can just go ahead and create your own setup so that you can start working with it. So first of all, we're going to go ahead and find our parent element. So in this case, these are going to be our items in the future, and then this div is our main element. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to go ahead and give it the display property of flex. Now, instead of doing something like block or inline block, instead, we set it to flex. And what this is going to do is create our flex container. Now, watch what happens. You can see now that instead of having it just in a row, all of these items have been spaced out accordingly. Now, all of the default values of all of the flex properties have now been set up now that our display mode has been activated. Now in the next few videos, we're actually going to be going through and manipulating these properties. For example, changing the order, we're going to change the size and width of these, and we're going to go ahead and justify and align the content. But that's for a future video. For now, all you need to know is that by setting the display property to flex on a parent container, it's going to set up all the default values of the flex properties and create the flex container that we want to work with in the next few videos. All right, let's move on. So in this video, we are going to be covering two of the properties of our flex container, direction and wrap. So right now we have everything set up. We have 5 flex items here labeled A to E, and then we also have our container. But now we're going to go through and start manipulating it. So the first thing I want to talk about is flex direction. So pretty much right now it's laid out in a row here, but what we can actually do is specify the direction that we want our items to go in. We can also reverse the order using a special suffix. Let's get started. So the property that we're going to use is flex direction, flex-direction, and you add this to the container, to the flex container. So here we're going to specify either row or column. Row is the default value and it's going to be going in a direction to the right side of the container. But we also have column, which is what we kind of saw before. And you can see it's a little bit better spaced out. And you can see it goes A to E, except it goes in a column. Now that's pretty easy to understand, but we can also go reverse. So instead of A to E, it goes E to A. All we have to do is add dash reverse to column or row, and it's going to flip the direction that our item is going in. Let's refresh. And now you can see it's going in reverse. We can also do the same thing with row or pretty much any other value for this property here. You can see now it goes E to A, and it also goes in the opposite way to the left side of the page instead of to the right side. So that's it for flex direction. It's very easy to understand. I'm just going to go ahead and set it back to row, the default. The next item I want to talk about is flex wrap. So this is a little bit more complicated to understand, but once we start using it, it gets quite easy. Pretty much when you wrap an item, it's going to move it to a new row or column to avoid the exceeding the maximum length. So for example, if we had more than the specified amount of items here, so if we had A, B, C, D, E, and then F, G, H, I, and all the ways to K or L, we don't want it to keep going on forever. So what we want to do is once it gets to a certain length, wrap it around and move it to a new line. So I'm actually going to go ahead and do that here. I'm going to